All right, we are going to start. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining our series today, our session today on meeting facilitation, how to ensure a successful facilitation and meeting. And as I was just chatting a couple minutes ago, I thought we should essentially start on time because otherwise we're not demonstrating one of the key points of a successful meeting, which is not to penalize the folks who arrive on time. So thank you for joining early. Hopefully several other colleagues will join us along the way. I want to hopefully also kind of model effective meeting preparation. And so I want to start by saying that my goal today is for us to talk a little bit about what the biggest challenges we see in facilitating meetings. Talk about three different meeting types, kind of the regularly scheduled meeting, sort of the ad hoc meeting, and what I'll call the more public panel sort of meeting. And then a little bit about the art of consensus making, all in our usual very short time together. So with that, I'd love to have people briefly introduce themselves by name and community, and then we'll jump in. So why don't we go based on how I see you on the screen. And that will start with Mara.
Hi, I'm Mara Coven-Gelman, and I'm in Buffalo, New York.
Great. Welcome, Mara. Jacob? You can all pre-unmute, so it will move quickly as well.
I'm Jacob Markey, and I'm with the JCRC in Miami.
Great. Leslie?
Hi, I'm Leslie Anderson, and I'm in Atlanta.
Terrific. Elisa?
I'm Lisa Armoni. I'm with the Jewish Federation in Orange County, California.
Great. Jackie? I don't know if Jackie can hear us in Cincinnati. You can. Jackie from Cincinnati. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Nelson, and I'm with the Jewish Federation in Greater Portland and Portland, Oregon.
Great. Eliza? Okay. I have Eliza Norstein here. Which community is Eliza from?
Actually, I don't have her community. So, Eliza, if you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat, we would love to know.
And I have Cheryl Nail, who I think doesn't have a microphone. She's from Columbia.
In Florida.
Great. Thank you, Eliza.
And then we have Cheryl Nail from Columbia. I assume that's Columbia, Maryland. And then we have, or Columbia, South Carolina. Okay, great. And then Brandon?
I'm Brandon Fish. I work with the Jewish Federation of Charleston, South Carolina.
Terrific. Michelle? She also doesn't have a microphone, and she is from Greater Dallas, the JCRC of Greater Dallas. And Debbie Klein?
Hi, Debbie Klein in Cleveland.
Terrific. Welcome, everyone. Did I get Nahaya?
Hi, Leftig from JCPA.
Terrific. Did I get everyone? Okay, wonderful. Welcome. And so one thing about introductions is, first of all, not to forget them. I've been to many meetings where people are in the middle of the agenda and then they realize they haven't had folks go around the room. Secondly is to define the parameters. Right? So you may want people, as I've done in many of our previous sessions, to introduce themselves by way of talking about a particular issue in their community. I may want them to give a word of background on what they did before their lives at JCRC. But you're cognizant of how much time you want those introductions to fill, and you don't want to get nervous by the time you're going to the fourth person out of 35 and going around the room and then realizing that you've cut into half your meeting. So always define the parameters, and don't be afraid to, without making it sound personal, move past the one who's been the most abusive of time, go to the next person, and then after the next person who's modeled it, say, let's keep it going at this fast rate, so that it doesn't feel like you're calling somebody out in a very personal way. But I think it's one of the key parts of effective meeting facilitation is that you, as the professional, have a really good sense of where time could be eaten up that you want to save. One thing I like to do is to very briefly say what a meeting is about, and then jump into introductions, and then go back to a little bit fuller explanation about the meeting. And that's what I tried to do today. So a little fuller explanation is that I may be wrong, but my general sense is that the nature of our work in JCRC is that we get so focused on our day-to-day work, both the reactive and the proactive stuff, that the meetings that are coming up, particularly the regularly scheduled meetings, are often a little bit of an afterthought in terms of putting as much time and thinking into the preparation for those meetings as maybe they warrant. And my goal here today is not to come up with a formula for a perfect meeting. This is all art, not science, but to hope that as a result of today, we'll all be a little more planful in certain areas, and as a result, we'll have people walking away from the meetings feeling that they're more effective. I have to say that I think people don't generally think in terms of, God, they have the best meetings in the world. That's just not how people think. But they know if they've been to a meeting that they feel like is a waste of time. And we want to be sure is that we're creating meetings that are moving the needle that we want to move on whatever subject, and that are experienced by the people who we frankly care most about what their experience is, as a very good use of their time. And so that's my goal here today. So one of the things I wanted to start with is to ask anybody who would like to volunteer, rather than everyone feeling that we need, that you need to chime in, but everyone who wants to volunteer, and just kind of hold your hand up, or if you're not on video, and I continue to strongly encourage video participation wherever possible, just chime in, and I'll indicate if somebody's already speaking. What is the thing that you find the biggest challenge in creating a successful meeting environment? And I'd love to know what it is, and then I'll hopefully touch upon those as we move through. So who would like to start?
I'll say that it's very difficult to keep people engaged sometimes, to keep everybody engaged in what we're discussing as we move on from topic to topic.
So there was something in one of the handouts I sent you that I'd never seen before, which is that according to a CBS News survey, at some point or another, 39% of people nod off in meetings. So we want to reduce that percentage considerably. So that was Brandon, I think, right? Mark.
Yes, sir.
Hi.
And if you're not on mute and there's back talk, if you could make sure you're on mute, that would be great. Mark.
I have a couple of things. I think preparation, that goes to the chairs or co-chairs and the people attending. How I try to do this, or I've been trained, is I create chair notes and hopefully have a conversation with my chair, so at least they're prepared with the issues, because I've seen people just come in and take the chair notes and read them seconds before the meeting starts.
Right. Okay, great. So it's making sure the chair is paying attention to what they're supposed to do in a way.
This is Rachel, trying to keep people from having side conversations and going off in their own direction.
Okay, great. Well, not great, but important. Thank you.
Doug, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I can't see myself anymore. I hid myself because I was eating a giant cupcake, and now
I know it looked really good, Jackie.
It was delicious. It was so good.
Fabulous.
So I wanted to point out that oftentimes I think what I struggle with is setting realistic objectives and goals for the meeting, and oftentimes we're stuck with an hour, and then all of a sudden we have to eat a whole whale in the hour, and we're not focused about what we need to tackle, and then we end up rushing, and the whale doesn't get eaten, and we all feel like it was a waste of time.
Got it. Okay. And I think everybody has experienced that at some point or another. So important one. Thank you. Who else? Other challenges you find? I think a common challenge I'll mention is when is it the professional's role? If the chair is kind of not moving things along, when does the professional step in? When does the professional step back? And again, I think that's more art than science. Hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Anything else that people find challenging in successful meeting?
This is Leslie from Atlanta. I would say one of the challenges I have is just making sure my board is engaged and stepping up to make suggestions so that I'm not doing all the driving.
Okay, great. Engaged in the discussion?
Yeah, and just bringing topics to the board.
Got it. Okay. All right, good. Other thoughts? Anybody else? All right, terrific. So I want to utilize some documents. There are many resources on the web, but I want to utilize some that are not, exactly for the nonprofit environment, but I think are readily adaptable for it. And I want to kind of talk through how I think we can adapt some of those lessons as we look at the handouts. But I want to also, Haya, do you know if Melanie's joining us today or not? She's not. Okay. I want to talk about, first of all, 3 different meeting types. I want to talk about the regularly scheduled JCRC meeting, the ad hoc meeting, and the larger public meeting space, panels, public events, and the like. Mostly on the first 2. For me, the regularly scheduled meeting, that by which I mean if you have your JCRC council, your board, your JCRC main committee, whatever you call it, meeting on a monthly basis and every other month basis, whatever it is. Question is how one approaches the idea of making that meeting successful. So the first thing I want to suggest is that, at least in my experience, JCRCs often are not the most social environment compared to what they could be. We tend to focus on the heady issues of the day, and we tend to think that that's the main driver for why people are there. So one thing I have found that can be very useful is to have simply a, light hors d'oeuvres before the meeting for a half hour for people to just schmooze, to just get to know each other, and to actively encourage people who don't yet know each other to do so. It's not something that I say that I've seen done a lot in JCRC land, but it's something that I wholeheartedly encourage. The second thing is the preparation, and this was mentioned with the chair of the meeting, is very, very important beforehand. To send an annotated agenda is one step, but the important step is to then have a conversation with the chair beforehand about that annotated agenda and what is it that we want to happen in each case throughout the agenda, and who's going to bring it. The third thing is that when you develop the agenda, it lets you look at whether or not you kind of are sharing the responsibilities enough. Do you have enough voices in the meeting? Are people going to simply be hearing the same kinds of voice? Is there the proper balance between a visiting speaker, a report, and an action item? I would say that every meeting probably should have some combination of the 3, with the reports being by far the least amount of time that's spent. The visiting speaker can be helpful because it can reinforce something great that JCRC is doing in the community, but you want to be careful that doesn't feel like you're just trying to fill time with a visiting speaker when they could go and hear speakers in all sorts of other settings. After all, this is your JCRC business meeting. And so the judicious use of a visiting speaker is important. And then there's the action item. The action item may be formal action. It may be discussing what JCRC should do on some issue that's arisen in the community, but it's the one that will be the meatiest discussion, will engage people the most, and where hopefully the outcome is direction for JCRC. It doesn't always mean a formal action process. It can be a sounding board. It can be an informal set of ideas for JCRC to take forward. We did an analysis just to give you a sense of how the landscape has changed, most JCRCs were established primarily to serve as the consensus-making body for the community. We did an analysis in San Francisco and determined that we were really only considering a formal consensus document about once every 18 months. So the question is, what are we doing with folks the rest of the time? Well, one of the answers is we were meeting too often. We were filling time. So one thing I suggest also looking at in terms of effective meeting facilitation is if at some point you feel like you are filling time because there's not enough work to do, not enough action items, then maybe reducing the number of meetings of the main body and then having more town halls, more executive committee sessions, whatever the structure opportunities are, more task forces is something to look at. So I want to strongly encourage thinking about that possibility as well. The third thing or fourth thing I want to mention is that when you deal with the annotated agenda, so you've now got that kind of, as I said, three-part idea of reports, outside speaker action, with action being hopefully by far the greatest percentage of what the meeting is going to be. An outside speaker might be a panel, it might be something that's lively. You're primarily using it as a draw, even though it shouldn't have to be a draw, and a validation of the work that JCRC is doing in the community. You've done something great in the, dealing with an issue in the public schools that came up. You have somebody who talks about how wonderfully helpful JCRC was, for example, on that. So, so I'm not talking about the kind of speaker that you might have in another venue, but it's to walk through that annotated agenda with the chair beforehand is critically important in order to make sure that the chair is really focused and not reading it just right on the spot. I also have to say, and I don't know what others of you have experienced, I tend to be lean with regard to annotated notes. I think people actually inadvertently contribute to the likelihood of it not being read if it's too cumbersome. So I would rather have 3 or 4 key bullet points under item 2 for the chair than I would a whole page of what I expect the chair to say verbatim. I also find it stilted if, and I mean this in any setting, if I'm writing everything for the chair. The chair has to also find his or her own voice too. But to go through that annotated agenda, I think is really important. So we've talked about kind of what the components are of the meeting, and there are a few other things I want to mention, and then I want to quickly look over. I'll have already touched on them in terms of the tips for successful meetings. One is, I think it's important to take a look at the list of attendees who are coming and to sometimes be proactive, not because you want a number count, not because your number's low, that you normally get 22 people and there are only 14 who have said they're coming, but because you want to be sure the right people are in the room. Now, here a cautionary note. By right people, I don't mean that you're lobbying for the position that you favor on something. I'm meaning a kind of what I'll call equal opportunity approach to folks from different segments of the community, but where you know that their voice adds a kind of gravitas, an importance to the discussion, will help others engage in a positive way, will neutralize negative energy in the meeting. It could be any combination of those, but I think it's very important for that to happen. So, you do the pro forma follow-up with everyone. Are you coming to the meeting? But also, you might identify 3 or 4 people whose personal presence at a meeting can change it in a way that you think is going to create a positive outcome. And I don't think you should hesitate from doing it. I have to say, in my 34 years at JCRC, I don't think I once called somebody up and said, I need you to be at the meeting to vote in favor of X. I never once did that. However, there were countless times that I called people up and said, your presence will really make a difference at this meeting, because people will listen to that person, because they'll come up with very thoughtful perspectives that will enrich the meeting. So that I really want to encourage as well. Now, the obvious thing that I want to say here is and this will show up in the materials, or it did show up in the materials, is that the clock is both the friend and the enemy of a meeting. But I have to say that about 20 years ago, we had a JCRC chair who made it clear that he would never end a meeting a minute late, regardless of what the subject was. And every chair has followed that model subsequently. And it makes people come back. If you drift into that 15-minute, 20-minute overage period, you begin to lose the confidence in folks that their time is going to be fully respected. And so creating that kind of martial law around ending meetings on time is crucially important, which is why, back to what I was talking about, utilizing the time meaningfully is critically important. Now, depending on the number of people you have, without it feeling like make work, I often think that JCRCs don't do enough in terms of breaking people into smaller groups. So utilizing that technique for engaging people who are often not engaged in discussion, and then having report outs of those groups. So you're facing an issue on a local campus and talking about how JCRC might approach that issue and working with Hillel on the campus. Or you're looking at how to improve relations with liberal Protestant ministers in the community who are showing more and more inclination to get drawn into the BDS movement. So you break folks up around different subjects. They may all cover the same subject, or you may give all a slightly different task, and then they'll report it back. And what's critically important, whether it's in the small group or the large group, I find I'm stunned by the number of times that I've seen people not take notes of what has been brought forth. And I think that's really important. And so I want to encourage you, because I think, how much you'll use of it, you'll ultimately decide. But if a group is reporting out, or you're having a general group discussion, to have that large, Post-it board that you can write down the key points on, or have somebody designated as the scribe write those key points on, can be very validating for folks who will feel heard, will know that their ideas are being taken into consideration. But again, just as I said at the beginning, I think we sometimes don't fully appreciate that it's difficult for some in a large group to assert their voice. It's why I think that social half hour is critically important. It's also why I think sometimes breaking it down can be critically important as well into smaller groups. I really want to urge you to play with those techniques. I don't think we should become devotees of any one thing, such that every single meeting has to have that. And you never want to force anything. If you don't have the right speaker, don't have a speaker at that meeting. You don't have the right subject to break folks up into small groups, you don't need to do that. But to at least think that through in sufficient time so that you can plan for people, to feel, wow, my time was really respected and used well, I think can be very, very helpful in terms of creating the ambiance of a successful meeting. Now, most of what I've talked about so far is for what I'll call preset, monthly, whatever it is, JCRC meeting, larger group, whether it's a representative body, whether it's an ad hoc, whether it's an at-large body. But many of these same techniques are appropriate for smaller ad hoc meetings. Let me tell you what I first of all mean by an ad hoc meeting. I mean a meeting that's not a regularly scheduled meeting, but where a group of concerned members of the community are coming together, Jewish and non-Jewish, to discuss a specific issue. It may be a one-shot deal. It may be something that's a group that's going to convene 2 or 3 times. It may be a group that is coming with no animus, or it may be a group that's really mad at the JCRC or Federation for some action that's taken. So think of post-Iran deal, for example, and you have a delegation of 8 people who are really upset that your Federation took a position against the Iran deal. Or you have a group of 8 people who are really upset that your Federation didn't take a position against the Iran deal. Or you have a group of people who think that the Jewish community has been really weak in terms of responding to BDS issues on the campus. Or you have a group that wants to figure out how to make inroads into the more progressive community on Israel issues, including the LGBT community, the liberal Protestant denominations, the African American, Latino community, whoever it might be, and wants to sort of brainstorm around that. So unlike the other kinds of meetings where you may not send a meeting agenda out in advance, I think what is important in these kinds of settings, and then we're going to quickly review the docs and open it up for discussion. What's important in these kinds of meetings is first of all, to set the tone, to help people kind of, without doing this in a condescending way, sort of take a deep breath, say we're all here because of our commitment to achieve X, that we're looking forward to a civil and robust discussion. And again, in a regular JCRC meeting, civility is presumed. In an ad hoc meeting, civility needs to be asserted if it's particularly over a burning issue in the community, which people have been worked up on. And yet, many of the same things apply. The importance of having somebody who's taking notes so that people feel listened to. The idea of going to the board, having an agenda that gets set, if not before, but at the very beginning of the meeting, by asking the simple question, what is it we want to accomplish by the time we conclude the meeting today? And also by agreeing to an end time. If you haven't published it beforehand, that meeting starting at 3:30, we're going to, let's agree that we will conclude no later than 5:15, whatever it may be. You can decide how much time it is so that people know that there's a clock that's ticking there and that they should be constructive with their time. Now, what's common in both meetings is there may be somebody who is going to try to dominate with their voice. It's a power play. They're going to try to drown out other voices because they're so sure of their own perspective. And those are not easy to manage. And one of the things it's important to talk to who's ever chairing that meeting is how they're going to manage that. And for you as the professional to be prepared in the absence of seeing that done effectively, for you to do that, for you to be willing to say, look, there are other folks who haven't been heard from. We're going to be sure that we have an opportunity for everybody to be heard from, and don't be afraid to stand up to somebody who's trying to play a kind of bully role in the community, in the meeting. I think it's very, very important. And I think people will respect that greatly. At the same time, I often say that, and this has to do with public speaking generally, that it's important to know your audience. When you have an audience, whether it's at a regular meeting or it's at an ad hoc meeting, for you to be cognizant of who is in that audience. Who are the 3 people you most want to reach? Who are the people that are critically important at the end of the day that kind of get whatever the message is that you need to deliver, and to make sure that they receive that message, to always be cognizant of that fact. If there's a important major leader in the community that you want to hear that message, an elected official, it's the president of the federation, whoever it is, to always be cognizant of that. Not to overly defer, but at least to be aware of that. So I mention that because I think it's important. And then relating to that ability of somebody to try to dominate the discussion is the tendency for people to get off track. And here you'll see in both the recommended readings I sent, the recommendation that I use in every meeting called the parking lot, and simply assert it at the proper moment. Like, I don't necessarily even mention the words parking lot until it becomes applicable. But at some point when somebody, you're in a meeting about the Iran deal, and somebody wants to talk about, and somebody says, I'm really upset the Federation did this. By the way, I'm also upset with the cost of entry into the community and how much it costs to be a player in the community. That's a parking lot issue, right? So you are the keepers of that. You are, in a sense, the keepers of staying on track in every single way, staying on time in every single way. By the way, critically important, I've been stunned at how many meetings I've been to where the chair of the meeting is at one side of the room and the professional is in the middle of the room somewhere. In my judgment, you should never be anywhere other than sitting directly next to the chair. It is absolutely not only legitimate, it is imperative that you be able to communicate with the chair at any moment. It may be, are we going to take a vote on this? It may be, it's time to move on. It may be, so-and-so has had her hand up for 30 minutes and you haven't recognized her. Whatever it is, never place yourself anywhere other than next to the chair. And if somebody's sitting there when you're ready to sit down, normally put all your stuff there in advance, except if it's confidential. If somebody's sitting there, just tell them that's my seat. Do not abdicate that opportunity, because that's critically important. So those are some of the ideas that I wanted to throw out. It's not comprehensive. Before our taking a quick look at the tips list, but let me pause there for your feedback, because I've now, well, with intention, been the outside speaker, I guess, for this meeting, and now want to invite for your participation in it. Questions you have, comments you have, other things you're thinking about, as I mentioned, some of the suggestions that I've thrown out here. Who would like to start? Leslie, please unmute yourself.
One agreement that we have in our board is that as we sit down and start going through the agenda, if we decide that there's not enough for a meeting, that it would be in fact kind of a waste of time, that we'll either not have the meeting or we'll go to a phone conference as opposed to an in-person meeting, as a way of trying to cut down on the amount of time or energy that people have to invest in just kind of hanging out just for the sake of hanging out. So we try to share information online or through emails, and then save our meeting time for when we need to get everyone together to make certain decisions.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that, for mentioning that. Let me ask people quickly, how often does your regular body, whether it's called the JCRC Council, that larger body, how often does it meet in your community?
Every other month.
Every other month? Others?
Also every other month.
About 8 times a year.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, good. Okay, other comments or suggestions that people have? Thank you for that, Leslie.
Doug, I would add to that our executive committee meets on the other month. So
Okay,
we
great.
have, the smaller body that sort of acts in place of the board in the interim, meeting to kind of strategize about where we're headed, and make decisions, every other month as well.
Great. I appreciate your mentioning that. And I will say in a larger JCRC, like in the Bay Area, our executive committee meets the week before the full body in order to set the agenda. And we'll have come in with a draft agenda, and they may want to move things around. By the way, one of the pieces of the agenda is to think about, when you look at the agenda for the larger meeting, think about what is going to keep people in the room and what's going to have them say, I'm going to leave a half hour early. And it's, you want to try to make sure that the last part of the agenda is the stuff that everybody's going to want to stay for. You may still have the kickoff speaker at the early start, but you really want to be cognizant that like I have to say that most people would kind of be bored if they were hearing a legislative update on what's going on in Sacramento. And I would just try to get that before there was going to be drift. And so by the time we were, 20 minutes from adjournment, we were like where people who might normally put their coats on would be saying, there's no way I'm going to miss that. Do you want to have that? There's no way I'm going to miss that as your last piece whenever possible. Other comments, thoughts, things you've found have been helpful. while you're thinking about that, I just want to come to the question of side conversations. I want to simply suggest that the chair be to be prompted in advance to be willing to say something if there are side conversations going on during the course of the meeting. I mean, I think that it's something that generally most people would see as rude, that it is appropriate to call it out if it happens and simply say, we have one conversation, let's keep it focused toward the chair. I'm not spending time today talking about Robert's Rules of Order and other things that I think can be helpful or a challenge in the course of a meeting. I do think that one thing that's important within Robert's Rules of Order is the tradition that when a person speaks, they're speaking to the chair. They're not speaking to somebody who just spoke and getting into a personal back and forth with somebody. They direct their comments to the chair. And that can be very, very helpful. When I mention that in the context of side conversations, it's simply easy to say, we're having one conversation and we want to be able to make sure that we're all directing our comments to the chair. So I really encourage that. I think if people are willing to do that, I think willing to say that, if the chair is willing to say that, if great, people will comport. If the chair is not willing to, then that's another case where you as the professional will simply step in and say that. Sometimes I'll even walk over to that part of the room and quietly whisper to somebody, this is kind of making it hard for everybody to listen. Can we focus on the conversation at hand? And usually they're folks who know better. Mara.
I think because we're just starting out, we have this, ability to have kind of a code of conduct, and kind of to review that. So I think a lot of the Jewish values that we're all based on, we can also open up with our committees. So the idea of kind of, derech eretz and like treating each other with respect, I don't find the sleeping issue as much as on the tablet or the cell phone, which is also disrespectful to committee.
I think that's really important, and I think encouraging. And I have to say, I'm one of those who, when I see people on the cell phone, I feel, a little of the air goes out in a way. It's like, really, that's more important than staying tuned to that. And people have become habituated to doing it. So I think the chair mentioning something about that can be critically important. We need everybody's full participation. Let's put our cell phones away and let's really focus and show respect to what everybody has to say. So I thank you for mentioning that. Other comments?
Doug, I was going to say, I don't know what other people's board cycles are like, if they pick up, after the summer finishes around Labor Day. That's the way ours works. And so we particularly are really trying to think strategically about how we set the expectations in our first board meeting. And we did something really effective last year where we invited everybody as part of their introduction to talk about what drives them to what drives them to do this work and why they feel it's important to be in the space and to be part of the group, and why they've prioritized their time that way. And it was galvanizing, I think, to sort of set the tone for the rest of the year that we're going to have difficult conversations and we're going to disagree, but we're all here for the same reasons and we all command that same respect, as from each other. It worked nicely.
Great. I think that's a great idea to do something like that. I also think some of you may have a board retreat during the course of the year, and that's sort of a separate subject, parking lot. But I would say that, when you do a board retreat, you want to make sure that the kinds of things you cover are not the kinds of things you would cover in a normal meeting. And having that opportunity to dig more deeply, is certainly something that comes up. But again, I think, apropos what Jackie's saying, the more that can be done to help people know each other. I mean, we're that table that brings together the most diverse cross-section of the community. People are often grateful simply for that opportunity. And I really encourage it. So I think that's a great exercise that you mentioned. Other thoughts? What you've done to make for an effective meeting? While you're thinking of that, one question, two things that came up when I asked initially about what some of the challenges are. One was about setting realistic goals. So I think that's less of a concern for the regular meeting. The regular meeting, I think we talked about a lot. For ad hoc meetings, again, I think getting everyone at the beginning to set an agenda for the meeting, and also to understand that any first meeting is often, the rule of thumb I would give is that for any first meeting, you're likely to end up where you would wish you could have started at the end of a first meeting. You've kind of just introduced the topic, you've introduced yourselves, and I think unapologetically simply say, look, this is an introductory meeting. We're going to get as far as we can, but we're only beginning to cover this topic. And now let's talk about what we want to be sure we are able to accomplish today. Let's set the agenda for today, and if we need to come back, we'll come back. But to recognize that in almost any case, that first meeting is going to be take the air, feel like an introductory meeting, which I think is just okay. And then the other piece about engaging members. So again, part of this relates to what I was suggesting before, reaching out to folks who you want to be sure are at the meeting and encouraging their voice. Part of it is making sure that the chair, and if not the chair, that you are not letting one person dominate during the meeting. Part of it is creating those spaces for people who may not always feel like they can talk, such as in the small group sessions. And part of it is looking at the way you prepare the agenda to make sure that you're going to have different voices introducing different topics. So even if they're going to be, 5 very brief reports, 2 minutes each on upcoming events or on something else, to kind of get a number of people in the mix. I think that there are ways to actively engage the board, and then always to try to have that meaty discussion topic so that you are moving away from it being a report-heavy meeting, and to kind of think through what is it that will not just feel like a discussion for the sake of discussion, but at least be a useful sounding board. This is going to help us shape our strategy on X. We will take our discussion today on Israel and diaspora relations, and without attribution, report it to the Consul General of Israel. We will utilize this discussion today in a strategy meeting we're going to have with interfaith leaders next week, so that people always feel that there's a utility, that there's an actual follow-up piece to what you're doing. That's the other thing I really want to emphasize here. We have a tendency to move fast in JCRC, and sometimes we forget to go back and tell people what we've done with what they've conveyed. There's nothing more empowering than going back and saying, that discussion we had a couple months ago about how we might handle building better relations with the Muslim community? Well, here's how we followed up on it. That piece of legislation that people were concerned about in the state legislature on anti-Semitism or whatever it is, here's what the latest follow-up is on it. So to be sure to include that. Again, one classic piece of effective meetings is, theoretically, don't share in the meeting what you could put in writing beforehand in the form of a report. Unfortunately, people don't read anymore. And therefore, what rises to the top as the wow factor, as the stuff that people would really you'd want to be sure to know, tell them, because it'll remind people that discussion we had 3 meetings ago really led to something. And again, we have had times where we've had what we'll call a off the record, except to share with the Israeli Consul General discussion about how people are feeling about Israel right now. Just because we didn't have any other burning topic at the moment, except that was a burning topic in the room. So there's almost always some action that you can do with things, and I think it's critically important. let's take a quick look at the, hopefully you all printed it out or you have access to it, but Haya can also put up the 14 tips for leading a more effective meeting. And again, much of this is sort of in the business environment. And what really struck me about it is how adaptable it is. So I'm going to quickly, let's leave it up, Haya, and I'm going to quickly run through it. The first is to assign pre-work. And I think that's really important that, you know, that again, people don't just hear one voice in the meeting, that you've told people in advance, here's what we want you to do for the meeting. The second being an adopt everyone plays mentality, that you want to include as many people as you can. Obviously, thirdly is to make the meeting actionable. We talked about that should be as much of the meeting portion as you could. Catering to different learning styles for a winning meeting, which I think is very interesting. It says, so don't just talk and hit auditory styles, but instead also supply visuals, opportunities to interact and contribute, and ways for participants to stretch. You know, when there was a lot going on the anti-Semitism in France and horrific attacks on Jewish institutions, and the Prime Minister of France gave one of the most compelling speeches of all time about anti-Semitism, but it was 5 minutes long. Showing that video just somehow, you know, broke up the rest of the meeting and had a wow factor. So using different sensory techniques, I think, can be very important. Inviting fewer people is something that, you know, I'm gonna pass on for now. Treat it like a performance. I think that relates to what I was talking about before. It also relates to the larger audience setting, the panel discussions and the like. To think about your audience, practice ahead of time, remember setup, plan your beats, you know, etc. So to recognize that even while for you it's a meeting and like, oh shit, I have a meeting coming up in 3 days and I haven't really thought about it because we're dealing with crisis X in the community, is notwithstanding all that, to know that people are looking to you for advice, for counsel, for guidance, for analysis, for you know, and to really have the opportunity for you to think about what are those 5 compelling points that I want to put forward. Open with a bang. You want to get people's attention right at the beginning. Collaborate. By the way, breaking up into small groups can reinforce collaboration. Giving everyone time to think. Just saying, let's take 1 or 2 minutes and jot down notes you have on a particular question that's been posed, and we'll come back to it. Is something to think about. Making a real-time agenda. We talked about that particularly in the context of ad hoc meetings. Starting with the end in mind, critically important, to say this is what we want to be sure. If we accomplish nothing else today, we want to be able to accomplish this. I think is very important. To always review decisions to make sure that people are on the same page as to what's been decided. To start and end on time, and to create a parking lot, both of which we talked about. And so I really think it's great if, you know, if each of us thinks there are 3 areas here that I can work on and hone my skills in this area, then it's terrific. I don't know that the shorter version, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Meetings, has much that's different, except that I did mention before the reviewing of the attendees list, which I think is something that is not done enough of. It's kind of like the difference between whether it's kind of, this is, you know, it's a passive, passive fatalistic, it will be what it will be, versus I'm in control of our destiny here. And you want to be in control of your destiny by making sure that key people are going to be in the room. So I really love that one. The rest I think is stuff that we've talked about before, but I highly commend these 2 pieces to you. Again, I'm going to pause. Comments, thoughts, questions about effective meetings before I talk about the art of consensus. Is this helpful for folks? Hopefully implementable. I think if you just kind of make your own little list of these are the 10 things that will make for the most effective meetings, and stick with it. And experiment with it. Don't be afraid to experiment. You know, try that social half hour and see if that makes a difference in how people feel. put those few 3 or 4 points in beforehand at the beginning of the meeting about, putting your cell phone down and the like. Breaking up a larger group into smaller groups and reporting on that. Making sure that you've, stuck absolutely to the time and people walking in knowing, I know that this meeting will always end on time. I think all of those are really helpful guides. You decide which are the ones that are going to make the greatest difference or greatest change in your environment. But if there's one thing I want to say that I mean, a couple of sessions ago, we did a thing on navigating lay professional relations. This is one area where I don't know how to put this so delicately, where I don't think you can afford to sit by where the lay leader isn't doing his or her job at meeting leading. The lay leader is, I had a chair once who also was a national officer of JCPA, and he had a certain attention deficit, something or other. Brilliant guy, amazing leader. Every once in a while, I'd see him pick up the New York Times before the cell phone while chairing the meeting and start looking at the Times. And I would go up to him and say, sir, put your paper down. You are the chair of this meeting. And that's just an example. By the way, I all know who I'm thinking when I say he does the best job of training on bylaws. Of Robert's Rules of Order of anybody I've ever seen. But, chairs are have their own habits. And to have them come in and know they need to take command of the room. But if they don't, then it's up to you. And most of the times chairs are like grateful that you're stepping in and helping with that. You don't want to kind of talk over a chair. You don't want to contradict a chair. But if a chair is being passive in a role where you need active, we need to move along. You need to turn to the chair and say, we got to get to the next agenda item. That's your job. If you see that somebody's dominating the discussion and the chair isn't responsive to the need, say, let's hear from others. There are different ways to do it. So, and this is a case where I don't see it usually creating a tension. Chair is usually grateful. Some chairs are just better able than others to be assertive in this role. But you are the one who knows, I need this to be a successful meeting. I need the best people to want to come back. I need to be sure we end on time. I need to be sure we get X result out of this meeting. Okay, let me do one last piece and then we'll have some time for additional discussion. My favorite thing in terms of meetings is when we are trying to achieve consensus. And here I want to broaden the idea of what we mean by consensus. I mean, we may all have a different definition of it. Consensus in JCPA parlance is a majority vote. In San Francisco, it's a 75% vote on the final decision and a majority vote on any amendments up until a final vote. But by consensus here, I mean it also in the informal sense. I mean that many times you're not taking a vote. You're just trying to read the room. You're just trying to see if you can get everybody in general agreement to move forward on, here's our plan for how we're going to work more closely with campuses in our area. Here's our plan for how we're going to build a coalition against hate in our community, as I know you've done in Cincinnati. Here's our plan to engage with Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders on some of the tensions that have arisen in our community, whatever it may be. And in a sense that our mind is always driven to trying to find if we can find common ground. So I'm not talking here about that once every so often that we're taking a formal vote. I'm talking about our day-to-day efforts to bridge gaps and to find common ground. And I created this memo many years ago, actually when I first promoted Abby Porth to the position of Associate Director. And it tried to sort of draw on my own experience. And I gave a definition that I said, you have consensus when people on all sides of an issue walk out of the room shaking their heads muttering to themselves that they can't believe how much they gave up their positions, and they feel good about it. And here are the fundamentals that for me are critically important to train ourselves. First of all, into the listening. And what we're listening for when it comes to consensus is what is it that is absolute principle for somebody that they can't move on, and what would they much prefer would be different, but they're okay with moving a little bit or a lot on that, as long as they're able to adhere to their core principle. And there's the difference between what I'll call the unmovable and the movable. And one of our key roles in building consensus is to be able to distinguish between the two. So whether we're talking about a position on criminal justice, or a position on civil rights, a position relating to LGBTQ community, a position on the nation state bill, Iran, whatever it is, whether it's formal or if it's informal, to be able to make that distinction, I think is critically important. Secondly is trust building. I love the fact that I spoke on at a Friday night service in San Francisco right before a presidential election on what's at stake for the Jews. And a husband and wife came up to me at the Oneg Shabbat afterwards, and the wife said, "My husband and I have been arguing ever since you spoke. My husband thinks you're a Democrat and I think you're a Republican." And I just smiled, like, I know what I am. I have really strong views, but the fact that after all those years they didn't have a clue meant that I could build trust on all sides. Practicing patience, I think, is really important. Building consensus is a combination of finding just the right balance of positions and taking the time to move everyone along the process. Sometimes wearing people down to the point where they'll say, okay, I can live with that, is actually very important. And projecting positive thinking. When Haya was there, I think, I went in to the Frank Fellows and did a session on consensus building at the last JCPA conference. And I said, how many of you still think there's a consensus on in our community on the Middle East? And I don't think anybody said there was. I think they all said there wasn't. I said, okay, let's try. What do you think maybe people could agree on? And within 7 minutes, maybe, we had put 10 things up on the board. We all agree that Israel has the right to live in secure borders. We agree that Israel has the same right as every other community to defend its citizens. We believe in equal opportunity for all of Israel's citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So finding the easy wins, the early wins, is critically important in terms of finding consensus, because it projects the idea that we can ultimately find a way to agree on some of the harder things. We had a consensus process on affirmative action in San Francisco, and it's a tremendously difficult issue because it pits two equally important principles against each other: the principle of equal opportunity and the principle of individual merit. And yet we found that everybody agreed that there should be opportunities for people who have historically been denied opportunity to have an accelerated chance to advance in American society. So we needed to unpack that and ultimately kind of work through all the issues until we could reach the one that everybody assumed would make an impasse for everything. It's critically important. And then related to that is testing the ideas in a way that doesn't threaten people's core principles and creativity, keeping on coming up with ideas to bridge the gaps. And when it comes to testing people's ideas, one of the things that I think relates to trust building is you have a meeting, you have people sort of say, here's where I think we can all agree. You don't finish it necessarily at that meeting, but then you begin to work offline. But when you work offline, you want to be sure that you're going to folks who have strongly held views across the board here, not just on one side of these issues, and test different bridging ideas. Like, could you live with this? Here's a crafted consensus approach. Can you live with this? And go back and forth between different folks and using it as a sounding board, so that when you go into a second meeting, you've already got draft of something that has been tested outside, but you've also been transparent, saying at that first meeting, we'll test this with some folks to see if we're on target, or we need to keep shifting, and then sort of slowly you get there. So these are, I'm not going to go in depth on this because I do want to save more time, but I do want to say that at the end of the day, I think that the role of JCRs, that while there's a perception in our community that consensus no longer exists on any issue, the reality is that consensus exists on almost every issue. The question is, where does that consensus lie? And that consensus may lie in a different place than where it did 10 years or 20 years or 30 years ago. But there's almost always points of consensus that can be found. And the real value of consensus in terms of in terms of the extent to which it's at the heart of the JCRC, what makes the JCRC be what the JCRC is tremendous. And it's a very powerful skill to be able to utilize. And again, you may do this without ever saying, it's our goal to achieve consensus. It just becomes an automatic kind of skills that you employ in the course of trying to bridge gaps, trying to bring people together, trying to move the community along on whatever issue it is. When we had a disastrous blow up after the Jewish Film Festival, a Jewish Film Festival incident a number of years ago that some in the community thought was the most anti-Israel thing they'd ever seen, and they demanded that the Jewish Federation stop funding the Jewish Film Festival. We went to the Jewish Federation and said, look, let's bring together a group of folks with broadly held views and see if we can come up with reasonable boundaries that will work for the community, that will maintain the value of lively discourse and divergent views, and at the same time say there are reasonable boundaries. And that's how we developed the Federation guidelines that many other communities have adopted on Israel programming. We didn't call it a consensus process as such, but we employed all of the techniques of a consensus process. So to kind of internalize that in terms of our skills and meeting role, both positions the professional in a very powerful way, and lets us utilize what is one of the strongest assets of a JCRC in the process. Let me stop there, open everything up to discussion. I know I went through this quickly, but I am determined that of all our meetings together, all of our training series, I'm not going to end this one late. So, or I'll never hear the end of it. So let me stop there. Please chime in. Questions you have, things I didn't cover, things that you that resonated for you. I'm opening it up. Somebody jump in.
Doug, I had a question from
Sure.
when we were talking about meetings prior to the consensus conversation about reviewing. So in our case, every other month, 2 months passes between formal in-person conversations with our board. And I try to update folks via email when I have updates and when I feel like it's important for them to know how things are moving. But do you recommend in a situation like that, looking back at an agenda from the last time you got together to try and remember, even though you've been in this day to day, where the board left off and sort of what they would naturally expect? Because I can imagine, as professionals and certainly board chairs, I'm on the phone with my board chair every week, not every other day. We see things through and progress in 2 months can be expansive, but the board may be sort of left behind in some of that capacity. And so how much do you kind of tailor the next meeting based on the last meeting? How do you balance updates versus sort of moving forward? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me answer first of all by saying something that I would like to add to the conversation, which is the importance of minutes or the importance of meeting summaries. And I'll distinguish between the two. Minutes are kind of the formal document out of a board meeting or a council meeting. Meeting summary means you've got not extensive notes, but you've got kind of core decisions that have been made when you've even had an informal meeting. And always to have somebody who's doing those minutes or that meeting summary. Secondly, I can't stress this enough. I have to say, as somebody who has spent time writing minutes up, it is one of the things that is the greatest pleasure to defer and to put off. And it is 100 times harder if you do that. So I want to urge you with every ounce of my being to get those notes written up as quickly as possible after a meeting. It's amazing how it'll write itself versus if you have to do it much later on. So that's A. B, I would say, Jackie, in answer to your question, that this is a great opportunity to be able to look at what rises to the top and to say, you know, we had a 2-hour meeting or whatever it was, 2 months ago. There are 2 key things that happened at that meeting that I want to update people about. That's how I would do it versus I want everybody to remember what we covered last time. Just I would do it in that form. Obviously, it's important to send minutes out with the upcoming meeting and let people know. Again, minutes are a way of, gosh, I can't tell you the number of times I have gone back to minutes to look at a decision that was made or a discussion that was done years ago. Now, I have a pretty good recall. I can't always recall when something happened, but you may all remember that there was some of you were not in the field, but there was extensive discussion about the way in which the Jewish community should respond to calls for recognizing the Armenian genocide on the 100th anniversary of Armenian genocide. In San Francisco, we had that exact same conversation on the 75th anniversary. I could go back to the minutes that we had and looked at exactly how that discussion was. I knew what the outcome was because I knew that the Turkish government was so enraged that we supported recognizing the Armenian genocide that they sent Turkish television to the home of our chair to interview him on why we had taken a stand on Armenian genocide. But the point being that having that documentation is great and liberating, and at the same time allows you to say, these are the 2 points that, that were, we wanted to just give you an update about, or that required additional follow-up from our last meeting. Is that helpful? Okay, good. Thank you for asking that. Other questions? Comments? Thoughts? What are you going to take away from today that you think you can implement in your meetings that will be new or fresh from today's discussion? Anybody? Hopefully there will be things.
I think, this is Leslie from Atlanta. I think I want to go through the 14 points, and I think we do some of those things well, but there's some other things that I would like to try, like some of the breakout things, maybe some of the engagement things you guys talked about, or even doing more pre-meeting prep with some of my members, because we usually have board meetings, like our more executive board meetings, to see if I can get people more engaged before we even walk in the door, like so that they can take the lead on certain things so that I don't have to feel like me or my chair are doing all the talking. And so I think I just want to go through and kind of make a list of the things that I could improve, or try to implement.
And I would say that, for me, one of the chief goals was to say, how do I take this area that is often kind of an afterthought, in the sense that we've got everything else we're doing on a daily basis, and oh yeah, our monthly or every other meeting's coming up in 3 days. What are we going to do for it? And to look at that much more as an opportunity to engage the leadership and to have that kind of rich feedback and objective-driven agenda that could be very, very helpful for you. So that sense of planfulness to me is critical. Cheryl just sent in a note indicating that one of the key takeaways for her was this idea of breaking into small groups. And again, I think there's no harm here in experimenting in some of these areas. As I said, whether it's with the, we experimented with the Devar Torah at each meeting, asking newer members. The responsibility of the Devar Torah was for newer members, and we would give them a kind of template on how to do a Devar Torah. And we experimented with that, went on for years. I don't know if it's still going on with the kind of social hour or half hour beforehand with the breaking up of small groups. There may be other ways to do it. You can decide at some point if this will become a fixture, but my recommendation is not necessarily to lock in to something, but actually, mix it up with these different ideas and see which people will, respond to, in advance. Another key takeaway I really do want to reinforce is taking a look at that attendance list and making sure that if there are 3 or 4 people who you think can change the dynamic in a positive way who haven't yet RSVP'd, then to really do everything you can to encourage them to be there. And Leslie says she brings food and her board really appreciates it. I think there's a difference to sort of having people grab the food as they're taking their seat and they're being able to hang for a while beforehand. And I just want to say, we have a meeting. We started this a number of years ago. We have a member book which has a bio and a picture of every member that every member of the council has. But this idea that people don't really know other folks, they're just kind of walking in and it's a little bit of a cold environment, and to find ways without it taking too much time for people to share a little bit of their background. I mean, I was always blown away by who we had in the room, and I was always cognizant of how do I make sure that that other people really appreciate and value how extraordinary rich it is. We had at one point 8 Russian-speaking Jews as part of our council, and I just wanted to have a program one night where all 8 talked about what was their journey. What was their journey from being Jews in Russia, whether refuseniks or not refuseniks, to now wanting to take a seat at the JCRC. And there's so many people who have interesting journeys. So to find those moments, I think, can also be very important. Other final comments? Suggestions? Well, guess what? It's 10:15, 1:15 on the East Coast. Therefore, I must adjourn. If you have other questions, don't hesitate to ask. I hope you will all join for next week's session, which is, I had it here, and now buried it with all of the, here it is. Next week, how to position the JCRC as a highly valued institution within the Jewish community and beyond. One of my most favorite subjects. I hope many of you will be able to join. Thank you for your participation today. Thanks for filling out the evaluations in advance, and look forward to next time. All the best.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.